Hi everybody, this is Tim Keller, and this is an oral presentation of white paper number 9, which is City Theology. So these DNA white papers are coming to you, and we're giving them to you in written form, but also this kind of oral summary. Part of the DNA of City to City has always been what we call city vision. And city vision is what it sounds like. It's looking at the city through the lens of the Bible, as it were, through the spectacles of the Bible, and getting a vision for not only reaching cities, loving and serving and reaching cities, but even a vision of what cities are. So the Bible tells us a great deal about what cities are and how we should regard them, and then also how to minister to people in them. These papers are going all around the world, and I guess these talks are too. And the fact of the matter is that on different continents, cities are seen differently. So there are some continents and some countries and some regions in which the average person sees cities in a very positive way. They say, well, if you can live in a city, then you're important, then you're somebody. There's also, at the other end of the spectrum, there's North America, where Redeemer, the original Redeemer Church, started. And in North America, there's very much an anti-urban bias, especially amongst evangelicals. And therefore, when Redeemer got started, I, as the pastor, had to deal with the negative attitudes that people had toward the city. The reality is that the Bible is almost perfectly balanced, as we're going to show you in just a second. That the Bible is very realistic about what's wrong with the city and the flaws of it and the dangers of it, but also sees the positive, sees the blessing, sees the goodness that the city can do and bring to people. And therefore, no matter where you are in the world, the biblical vision of the city, you can use it on your people. Because if people have too naively positive a view of the city, you can show them what the Bible says about the dangers, spiritual dangers of it. If like myself, if you're in North America where so many Christians have such negative views of the city, then you can use the parts of the Bible that talk about its importance and the positive things that can happen there. So the Bible has something for all of us. We have to contextualize it, as it were. That is, we have to use it in the particular way that our particular communities need. But let me say, in the paper, the first thing we do is we look at what the Bible says about the city diachronically. Now, to read the Bible diachronically is to read it along the storyline of the Bible from beginning to end. That's what diachronic means. It means to read from Genesis to Revelation. And when you read the Bible like that about cities, when you say, well, what does Genesis and Exodus say about cities? You know, what does Psalms and Isaiah say about cities? What does the Gospels say about cities? What does Revelation say about cities? That's what we're doing. When you do that, you'll see that in the beginning, cities are actually seen in a fairly negative light. By the middle of the Bible, they're seen in a more positive light. And by the end of the Bible, they're seen in a most positive light. And that's pretty interesting. So let me explain what I mean. In the very beginning, the first city is built by Cain. Okay, that's not a great recommendation. And you see even in Genesis 4 that the first civilization starts coming out of cities where they develop tools and agriculture and all sorts of other kinds, and they develop art and music. But you can also see there's a violence to it because the city of Cain, the civilization leads to violence. When you get to the Tower of Babel, that was a city being built. That was a skyscraper, and of course we know that was done to make a name for ourselves. That's what they did. Then you have the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham and Lot, they divided, and Lot went into the city, and Abraham stayed out of the city, and it was better for Abraham to stay out of those cities. And so, and even when you get to Exodus, you see that the Israelites are enslaved in order to build cities. So cities are seen in a very negative way. They're places where human beings come together to glorify themselves, to make a name for themselves, to oppress, where the rich and the powerful oppress those who are not. But then when you get to when Israel is brought back to the Promised Land, suddenly cities in the Bible take on a different, you might say there's a different aspect. For example, God did not want Israel to be a completely rural society. He demanded that they build what he called cities of refuge. 6 cities, where if somebody was, if someone accidentally killed somebody else, they could run to that city where they could get protected. And the whole idea behind that is this, that it's in cities where jurisprudence begins, where civilization begins. Because people are living together, they have to develop ways of people living closely compacted together can live. And therefore, out in the countryside, if somebody accidentally kills somebody else, well, that family might just come and just kill that other family. But if you go to the city, that's where they have judges, and they have lawyers, and they have a way of dealing with complaints, because you can't live in a city without a way of adjudicating complaints. That's why God says, I want you to build cities, because cities build culture, and cities build jurisprudence, and cities develop human culture. And then, of course, God says, I want Jerusalem to be an urban society that's the joy of the whole earth. So, and even when the Jews go into exile, when they get to Babylon, they're told to pray for the peace of the city and to do everything they can while they're there for its prosperity. And so in the middle part of the Bible, we don't see this negativity toward the city you see in the early part. It doesn't mean that the city isn't still a bad place. It's no contradiction. But at the same time, it's showing that there are other aspects of the city that maybe we didn't see just in the book of Genesis and Exodus. Then finally, we get to the New Testament, and you'll see not only Jesus ministering in the city, he ministered in the Decapolis, which was 10 cities on the northern part of just outside, actually, of Judea. He ministered in the place where there were it was very urban. Decapolis means 10 cities. And he ministers there a lot. But Paul in particular, we see in the book of Acts, would target cities. He would plant a church in the biggest city in an area like Philippi in order to reach Macedonia. He'd plant churches in Philippi, and then he would leave the region, because he knew if you change the city, you change the region, because the city is the center of the region. And when you get to Revelation, you eventually see that in the end, when God creates a new heavens and new earth, a culture that is perfectly God-glorifying and a perfect culture for human flourishing, you know what you have? You have a city, the New Jerusalem. Now, what we learn from that then, synchronically, now when you read the white paper, it's going to say diachronically, you're reading the Bible across you're reading along the plot line. Synchronic is a word that means topically. What does the Bible actually tell you about cities? And the answer is these things. First of all, cities are good. That is, they're places where they're places of refuge and security. Why do you think immigrants go into cities? If an immigrant is coming to a new country, they go to cities because there's more people like them there that speak their language. There's newspapers in their language. There's restaurants, and there's civic associations. And cities are places of refuge for the people who don't have as much cultural cachet in a particular country. Secondly, cities are good because they are places where culture is developed. Gerhardus Voss explains why cities are both good and bad. And he says at one place, cities, while the accumulator of the energy of culture, cities are also an accumulator of the potencies of evil. Now, the idea of a city as an accumulator, it's another way of saying the cities are like a magnifying glass. What a magnifying glass does is it can concentrate the beams of the sun, onto a piece of paper, and it goes, into flame. In the same way, cities are not actually good or evil. Cities are magnifications of human nature, which means in the cities you see humanity at its best, and you also see humanity at its very worst. Because cities are the accumulator of human nature. They're the magnifiers of human nature. And therefore, cities are incredibly good. You can see the best almost of everything that human beings can produce in cities. And they're also the very worst. There can be tremendous poverty, tremendous corruption, tremendous racism, tremendous crime. And so instead of blaming cities for the bad, or romanticizing cities for the good, We need to see what we actually have in cities as cities bringing out what's in the human heart. And that's the reason why we can say cities are good, cities are bad, but most of all, cities are important. They're important for the culture. That is to say, generally speaking, the changes that happen to human culture happen in cities and they spread out to the rest of culture. So human cities tend to drive culture, and therefore they are important to, human society. But they're also crucial for ministry, because if you reach a city, then you can reach the society. If you like in the small town, you might reach the lawyers, one or two lawyers. But it's in the city that you reach the legal profession, because that's where the law schools are, that's where the guilds are. See? And therefore, by going into the city, even though city ministry is much more complicated and much more difficult and much more expensive, and like I said, much more complex than other kinds of ministry, it's really, really important. And the Bible calls not all Christians to go to cities, but the Bible does call some Christians to go to cities and all Christians to care about cities. So let me just end like this. At the end of the book of Jonah, God he's rebuking Jonah, because Jonah went to Nineveh only out of, he was forced to go to Nineveh. He didn't want to go to this great city filled with pagans. He didn't want to be there. And when he finally went, he preached, and a lot of them repented, and then God didn't destroy the city, and he got Jonah really angry. Jonah didn't even want to go and preach to Nineveh. But when it turns out that, he thought, well, maybe if I preach to Nineveh and they turn away, God will destroy them. But when God decides not to destroy them, he gets very angry. And at the very end, God is saying, you care about the plant that I grew up around your head. Why in the world aren't you concerned about the city with 120,000 people who don't know their right hand from their left? At the very end, he says, I am concerned. He says, should I not be concerned about this city? That's the last thing he says in the book of Jonah. He says to Jonah, shouldn't I be concerned? Shouldn't I have compassion on the city? Look at all those people. Here's the point. Not every Christian is called to go into the city, but city to city is filled with people who feel called to live in the city and minister to the city. And you know what God is saying there at the end of the book of Jonah? He's saying, I'm already there. I'm already concerned. I was concerned about the city before you were. I was having compassion on the city before you were. I was already working in the city before you were. And now that you're here, I just want you to know I've gone before you and paved your way.